The car came to a stop, tires crunching over the loose gravel of the driveway. I sat still for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tighter than I needed to. The house loomed ahead, a two-story structure that hadn't changed since my last visit. The paint was faded, and the porch sagged just a little more, but it was the same, timeless in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. I exhaled slowly, stepping out and shutting the car door behind me. The warm afternoon air was thick and humid, clinging to my skin as I retrieved my bag from the trunk. Before I could take a single step toward the front door, it swung open. She stood there, arms folded, surveying me with a sharpness I could feel even at a distance. It was the kind of look that immediately set me on edge, a reminder that nothing ever slipped past her. Her stance, rigid and poised, was as familiar as the house itself. The walk to the door felt longer than it should. The wood beneath my feet groaned as I stepped onto the porch, and I crossed the threshold into the same house I'd left months ago. It smelled like lemon polish and faintly of coffee, the kind of scent that made you feel like you'd never really left, even if you wanted to believe otherwise. Inside, everything was just as I remembered. The furniture was arranged in its usual spots, and the old grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, as if marking the moments I wasn't there. She moved ahead of me, straightening an already pristine kitchen towel, her movements deliberate. The weight of being here settled over me slowly, like a heavy coat. This was home, technically, but it didn't feel like it. Not anymore. The evening passed in uneasy quiet, filled with the hollow clinking of plates and the soft hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Every glance she gave me felt like a question she wasn't asking, and I wasn't offering answers. Later, in the solitude of my old room, I stretched out on the bed that was a little too small and a little too stiff. The familiar creak of the mattress as I shifted reminded me of nights spent staring at this same ceiling. The moonlight filtering through the curtains painted the room in faint silver, and I tried to focus on the quiet. But it wasn't quiet, not really. Beneath the stillness was an undercurrent I couldn't shake. Being here again, with her, felt like walking through a forest where the air was too still, where every rustle in the distance made you tense. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed the moments of the day, the way she had barely said anything, but had managed to make me feel like a teenager all over again. Nothing had happened. Not yet, but the weight of what wasn't said hung between us, thick as the humid air outside. Eventually, the exhaustion won out, and I drifted off, knowing full well that whatever this visit was going to bring, it was only just beginning. The morning came too quickly, sunlight filtering through the thin curtains, casting streaks of gold across the room. The warmth of the day had already started seeping into the house, but it did little to ease the unease that had settled in my chest. I dressed quickly, hoping to shake off the strange weight from the night before. The kitchen smelled like coffee and toast, a comforting aroma that didn't match the tension in the air. She was already there, moving with her usual efficiency, wiping the counter, straightening a vase of flowers that didn't need straightening. She didn't look up when I entered, but I felt her presence, the way she occupied the space with an unspoken authority. Breakfast was a quiet affair. The clinking of cutlery against plates filled the room, the occasional scrape of a chair as one of us shifted. I found myself hyper-aware of every sound, of the way the house seemed too quiet otherwise. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence was loud enough. Afterward, I offered to help with some of the household chores. It felt like the right thing to do, a way to make myself useful and avoid the weight of her watchful eyes. She handed me a bucket of soapy water and a rag without a word, and I took it as my cue to start scrubbing the windows. The work was mindless, and for a while, it helped. The repetitive motion, the sound of the rag against the glass, it drowned out my thoughts. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye. She was in the garden, pruning the hedges, her movements precise. Even from a distance, I could feel her presence, like a thread pulling taut between us. By midday, the sun was high, and the heat was oppressive. I wiped the sweat from my brow and headed inside, the cool shade of the house a welcome relief. She was in the living room, seated in her usual spot near the window, a book open in her lap. She wasn't reading, though. Her gaze was distant, fixed on something outside that I couldn't see. For a moment, I considered saying something, breaking the silence that had stretched between us since I'd arrived. But the words caught in my throat, and instead, I retreated to my room. The rest of the day passed in much the same way. We circled each other, careful not to get too close, careful not to say too much. It wasn't hostility. It was something else, something harder to define. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I found myself back in the living room. She was there too, of course, her book still unopened in her lap. I sat down across from her, the silence between us thicker than ever. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the faint creak of the house settling and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. It felt like the air was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, she looked up, her eyes meeting mine. There was something in her gaze, something that made my chest tighten. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was something softer but no less heavy. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but I already knew I wouldn't get an answer. The evening ended much like the day had begun, with unspoken words hanging in the air like ghosts. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were teetering on the edge of something, though I wasn't sure what it was or if I was ready to find out. The day started off uneventfully, a quiet rhythm settling into place. I helped her with small tasks around the house, anything to fill the hours. The silence between us felt less oppressive now, though still charged with something I couldn't name. I wasn't sure if it was relief or tension, but I told myself it didn't matter. By late afternoon, the air was thick and humid, the kind of weather that made you feel like you were wading through it. I finished cleaning up the back porch, my shirt sticking to my skin. She called from the kitchen, saying she'd made lemonade. Her voice was calm, even pleasant, but I could hear something beneath it, like the edge of a blade hidden in soft fabric. I joined her in the kitchen, where the cool tiles underfoot felt like a reprieve from the oppressive heat outside. She handed me a glass without looking at me, her focus seemingly on the condensation sliding down her own. The silence hung between us again, familiar but unnerving. "You've been working hard," she said finally, her tone light but measured. "It's good to have you back." I nodded, unsure of what to say. There was a weight to her words that I didn't want to unpack. As the evening crept in, she suggested we have dinner together, just the two of us. My girlfriend had gone into town earlier to shop for something she needed, and the house felt emptier without her. I agreed, partly out of guilt for how distant I'd been, and partly because I didn't know how to say no. The dining room was dimly lit, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the table. She'd cooked something simple but comforting: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. It was the kind of meal that made you feel nostalgic even if you couldn't place why. We ate mostly in silence. Occasionally, she'd ask a question about my work, my plans, my girlfriend. I answered as best I could, though my responses felt mechanical, like I was reciting lines from a script. After dinner, I offered to help with the dishes. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, handing me a towel. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, the space between us narrowing as we worked side by side. At one point, I reached for the same plate she was drying, and our hands brushed. It was such a small, insignificant thing, but it sent a jolt through me. I pulled my hand back quickly, but not before I saw the flicker of something in her expression. When the dishes were done, I turned to leave, but she stopped me. "Wait," she said, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. I froze, unsure of what was coming next. "You've changed," she said, her gaze fixed on me. "Since you've been away. You seem distant." I didn't know how to respond. The truth was, I had changed, but I didn't know how much of that she needed to hear. Before I could think of something to say, she took a step closer. Her hand grazed my arm lightly, a gesture that might have been comforting if it didn't feel so charged. "You can talk to me," she said softly. "You know that, right?" Her proximity made it hard to think. The air between us felt heavy, like it carried more than just words. Without fully realizing what I was doing, I nodded. And then it happened. She leaned in. Not much, just enough for me to notice, enough for the space between us to vanish. I didn't stop her. I told myself I couldn't. Her lips brushed mine, tentative at first, like testing the surface of thin ice. It wasn't planned. It wasn't thought through. It was a moment of weakness, a crack in the wall we'd both been trying to build. When she pulled back, the weight of what had just happened settled over us. Neither of us said a word. I turned and left the room without looking back, my heart pounding, my mind racing. Upstairs, in the suffocating stillness of my old bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. What had just happened wasn't something I could explain, even to myself. But I knew, deep down, that it was only the beginning. The following morning came with the kind of stillness that felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. I woke earlier than usual, restless and unable to shake the weight of what had happened the night before. My thoughts churned as I stared at the ceiling, replaying every second of that moment in the kitchen. She was already up by the time I ventured downstairs, moving through her usual routine as though nothing had changed. The smell of coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of the lavender cleaner she always used on the countertops. She didn't look at me when I entered the kitchen, her back turned as she poured a cup of coffee. For a moment, I considered leaving, just grabbing my keys and heading into town away from the house from her. But something kept me rooted in place, as if leaving would only make things worse. She finally turned around, her expression unreadable as she set a mug on the table for me. It was her way of saying good morning without saying anything at all. I sat down, and the silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. The day passed in fragments. I kept myself busy, doing anything to keep my hands and mind occupied. Mowing the lawn, fixing a loose hinge on the porch door, organizing the clutter in the garage. It didn't matter what the task was, as long as it kept me out of the house. But she was always there, a presence I couldn't escape. Every time I passed a window, I caught glimpses of her in the garden or walking from one room to another. Each sighting sent a jolt through me, a reminder of the line we'd crossed. By mid-afternoon, my girlfriend returned from her trip to town. She seemed in good spirits, chatting about the small shop she'd explored and the things she'd bought. I tried to match her energy, forcing a smile and nodding in all the right places, but my responses felt hollow. We decided to have dinner on the back porch that evening, the three of us together. The table was set with care. Her doing, of course. She had a way of making even the simplest meals feel intentional. The conversation was strained, though my girlfriend didn't seem to notice. She asked questions about the garden, the house, small things that didn't matter but filled the silence. I kept glancing at her, not my girlfriend, waiting for a crack in her facade, some sign that she felt the same unbearable tension I did. But she didn't falter. She answered every question with ease, her tone light and pleasant. It was as if the kitchen incident had never happened, as if we'd both agreed to bury it deep enough that it couldn't surface. The sun dipped below the horizon as we finished eating, the sky painted in streaks of orange and pink. My girlfriend excused herself to take a call, leaving the two of us alone. She stood up, clearing the plates from the table without a word. I hesitated, unsure if I should offer to help or let her handle it. The silence between us was louder than any conversation could have been. When she came back outside, she stopped near the table, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky. "It's going to rain tomorrow," she said, her voice calm, almost distant. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if she could see me. The weight of her words felt heavier than they should have, like there was something unspoken hidden beneath them. That night, as I lay in bed, the stillness of the house pressed down on me. I couldn't stop thinking about the look in her eyes when she'd spoken, the way her voice had carried just a hint of something else. Whatever fragile balance we'd managed to maintain was beginning to crack, and I wasn't sure how much longer it could hold. The next day came shrouded in gray clouds, a heavy sky pressing down on the house. The air was thick, the kind that warned of an impending storm, but it wasn't the weather that kept me on edge. Something was brewing inside the walls of that house, something I didn't know how to stop. I spent most of the morning outside, helping her in the garden. She'd handed me a pair of gloves and a trowel, explaining in her usual no-nonsense tone that the flower beds needed tending. The work was simple enough, but it did little to distract me. Every time she moved near me, bending to pluck a weed or adjust a plant, my chest tightened. She, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. Her movements were fluid, her expression calm, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But I couldn't stop noticing the small details, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of the potting soil, the faint smile that tugged at her lips when she glanced at the flowers. It was as if she were daring me to acknowledge the tension, to say something first. The afternoon brought a brief reprieve when my girlfriend suggested a trip into town. She wanted to pick up groceries for dinner, and I jumped at the opportunity to leave the house, even for a little while. The drive was quiet, the radio playing softly in the background. She talked about the recipes she found online, asking my opinion on what to make. I answered as best I could, but my mind was elsewhere. Every word felt heavy, as if it carried the weight of a question I wasn't ready to ask. Back at the house, the storm finally broke. Rain pelted the windows, and the wind howled through the trees. My girlfriend busied herself in the kitchen, humming quietly as she prepared the meal. I stayed in the living room, staring out at the sheets of rain, the sound of it drowning out my thoughts. Dinner was uneventful, though the atmosphere felt stifling. My girlfriend chatted about her day, her voice light and cheerful, but the words barely registered. My mind was elsewhere, caught in a loop of what-ifs and maybes. Afterward, my girlfriend excused herself to take a shower, leaving me and her alone in the kitchen. The hum of the dishwasher was the only sound between us as I leaned against the counter, unsure of what to say. She broke the silence first, her voice soft but firm. "You've been distant." I stiffened, not expecting the observation to be so direct. "I've just had a lot on my mind," I said, my words coming out more defensive than I'd intended. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment, sharp and knowing. "Don't let it fester. Things like that have a way of growing." She turned and left the room before I could respond, her words hanging in the air like an unanswered question. That night, as the storm raged outside, I lay awake, listening to the rain battering the windows. My girlfriend slept soundly beside me, her even breaths a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. I closed my eyes, hoping sleep would come, but it didn't. Instead, I replayed the day over and over, her voice echoing in my head. "Don't let it fester." I wasn't sure if it was advice, a warning, or something else entirely. But as I stared into the darkness, I knew the cracks were widening, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The rain didn't stop, a relentless patter against the windows that mirrored the tension inside the house. The world outside was gray, blurred and softened by the mist, but nothing felt soft within these walls. Everything was sharp. Every glance, every shift in movement, every thought that refused to be silenced. I spent the morning trying to lose myself in tasks that didn't matter. Cleaning the bookshelves, organizing drawers, wiping down counters that were already spotless. It didn't help. My hands moved, but my mind kept circling the same truths, running through memories I didn't want to hold on to. She moved through the house with her usual quiet efficiency, her presence unavoidable no matter how much I tried to keep my distance. She wasn't avoiding me, but she wasn't seeking me out either. It was as though she knew exactly how to keep the tension simmering just below the surface without ever letting it boil over. The afternoon dragged on, the rain easing into a light drizzle. My girlfriend spent most of her time in the living room, curled up with her phone, occasionally laughing softly at something on the screen. Her voice cut through the silence, a sharp reminder of how normal everything should have been. But it wasn't normal. Not anymore. By late evening, the rain had stopped, but the clouds lingered, thick and heavy. The house felt stifling, the air too warm despite the coolness outside. My girlfriend suggested a movie, and I nodded, too drained to argue. We settled on the couch, her body pressed against mine as she leaned into me. The glow from the television flickered across the room, casting shadows on the walls. I tried to focus on the story unfolding on the screen, but my thoughts were miles away, trapped in a cycle of guilt and longing I couldn't break. She fell asleep midway through, her head resting against my shoulder. I stayed still, letting her sleep, my eyes fixed on the screen, though I wasn't really watching. The weight of her against me was a reminder of everything I was supposed to care about, everything I was supposed to feel. When the credits rolled, I gently shifted her onto a pillow and turned off the TV. The house was silent again, the kind of silence that pressed down on you, heavy and unrelenting. I wandered to the kitchen, the faint creak of the floorboards the only sound as I moved. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the rain-streaked windows. The air was cool, almost refreshing after the oppressive warmth of the day. I stood by the sink, staring out at the garden. The flowers were drenched, their colors muted in the dim light. Everything looked softer out there, blurred and dreamlike, so unlike the sharp reality within these walls. She entered the kitchen quietly, her footsteps barely audible on the tiles. I didn't turn around, but I felt her presence immediately, an unspoken weight that settled in the air. She didn't say anything, and neither did I. We stood there in silence, the space between us filled with everything we weren't saying. Her movements were slow and deliberate as she reached for a glass of water, her gaze briefly meeting mine before looking away. The moment stretched on, heavy and charged. The kitchen felt too small, the walls closing in with every passing second. I could feel my pulse quicken, the weight of her presence pressing against me like a storm that hadn't yet broken. And then, as suddenly as she'd entered, she turned and left, leaving me alone in the quiet once more. I stayed there for a long time, staring out at the garden, my thoughts swirling like the storm clouds that still hung in the sky. Nothing had happened, but everything had changed. The line between us was no longer a line. It was a blur, a crack, a fracture that couldn't be undone. And I knew, deep down, that the worst was yet to come. The storm returned that night, thunder rolling low and heavy across the sky, rattling the windows of the house. Lightning illuminated the darkened rooms in sharp flashes, cutting through the stillness with an almost deliberate cruelty. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every muscle tense, every thought pulling me further into the storm brewing inside me. The sound of the rain hitting the roof was relentless, a constant rhythm that seemed to echo the restless pounding of my heart. Sleep felt impossible, the weight of the day pressing down too heavily. I turned over, glancing at my girlfriend. She was sound asleep, her breathing steady and untroubled. I envied her for that. Another crack of thunder rolled through the house, louder this time, shaking the very walls. It hit something deep inside me, stirring a memory I hadn't thought of in years. Storms had always done this to me, pulled me into a space where the world felt too big, too chaotic. I sat up, my chest tight, the shadows in the room growing darker with each flash of lightning. The air felt too thick to breathe, and before I could stop myself, I was out of bed, moving through the house on autopilot. Her door was slightly ajar, a thin line of light spilling out into the hallway. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the frame, but another clap of thunder sent a jolt through me. I stepped inside without knocking. She was sitting up in bed, her lamp casting a warm glow over the room. Her eyes met mine immediately, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. "I can't sleep," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her expression softened, and she nodded toward the chair by the window. "You've always hated storms," she said, her tone more understanding than I'd expected. I sat down, the chair creaking softly under my weight. The sound of the rain was louder here, the roof above amplifying its relentless rhythm. She watched me for a moment, then shifted, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You don't have to sit there," she said quietly. "If it helps, you can stay." I hesitated, my pulse quickening at the invitation. She gestured to the other side of the bed, her movements careful and measured, as if testing the waters. I moved without thinking, slipping under the covers. The warmth of the blankets was immediate, comforting in a way that felt both familiar and foreign. We lay there in silence, the space between us small but significant. The storm raged on outside, the thunder shaking the house with each passing moment. I felt her shift beside me, her breathing steady but shallow, as if she was waiting for something. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing, the weight of the moment pressing down harder than the storm ever could. "I don't know why I came here," I said finally, my voice cracking under the strain. Her hand brushed against mine, light as a feather, but it sent a jolt through me. "Maybe you do," she said softly, her words barely audible over the rain. I turned my head to look at her, and in the dim light, her expression was unreadable. There was no anger, no disappointment, just a quiet understanding that made my chest tighten. The space between us disappeared in an instant. I wasn't sure who moved first, but it didn't matter. Her lips met mine, tentative at first, as if testing the boundary we'd both been tiptoeing around for days. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, a line crossed that could never be redrawn. When we finally pulled away, the silence between us was deafening. The storm outside had become a distant hum, drowned out by the pounding of my heart. She didn't say anything, and neither did I. We lay there, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a second blanket. The air was thick with unspoken words, but none of them came. As the storm continued to rage outside, I realized there was no going back. Whatever line we'd crossed wasn't just blurred. It was gone, washed away by the rain. The morning after the storm was unnaturally bright. Sunlight poured through the windows, the rain-washed world outside sparkling as if nothing had happened. But inside, the house felt heavier than ever, the weight of the night before pressing down on every corner. I woke before her, lying stiffly in the bed, staring at the ceiling. The events of the night played in my mind like a broken record, each moment replaying with sharper clarity. My chest tightened as I turned to look at her. She was still asleep, her face calm, her breathing slow and even. She looked unburdened, but I wasn't. Slipping out of bed as quietly as I could, I grabbed my things and left the room. Each step felt deliberate, as though I was crossing a minefield. My heart raced, a dull thrum that matched the echo of my steps on the old wooden floor. The kitchen was empty, the house still silent. I stood there for a moment, gripping the edge of the counter, willing myself to breathe. The memories of the night refused to fade, as if they were etched into my skin. By the time she joined me, I'd already made coffee. She entered the kitchen without a word, her movements calm and measured. She didn't look at me as she reached for a mug, but the air between us was thick with unspoken things. I wanted to say something, to acknowledge what had happened, to confront the weight of it, but the words wouldn't come. So, we sat there, the silence broken only by the soft clink of the mugs against the table. My girlfriend returned from her morning walk shortly after. She was bright and cheerful, chatting about the crisp air and the way the storm had cleared everything out. Her presence filled the room in a way that felt suffocating, though it wasn't her fault. The day dragged on, each moment stretching longer than the last. The house felt too small, each room too close, each interaction too pointed. I tried to keep myself busy, doing anything to avoid the quiet moments when my thoughts would creep back in. But no amount of distraction could stop what came next. It happened that evening, just as the sun was setting. My girlfriend had gone to town to pick up something she'd forgotten, leaving the two of us alone again. The silence between us was different this time, heavier, almost daring. I was in the living room when it happened. She came in, her expression calm but focused. She stood there for a moment, watching me before stepping closer. "We need to talk," she said simply, her voice steady. I nodded, my throat too tight to respond. Before she could say another word, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. My girlfriend's voice rang out from the hallway, calling my name. Panic shot through me like a lightning bolt. I stepped back, putting distance between us as my girlfriend entered the room. She stopped short, her eyes darting between us. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice cautious. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scrambled for an answer. "Nothing," I said too quickly, my voice shaky. She narrowed her eyes, her gaze flicking between the two of us. Her expression shifted, her brows knitting together as realization dawned. Her voice dropped, cold and sharp. What did I walk into? I opened my mouth, but no words came. My silence said more than I ever could. Her eyes filled with something between anger and disbelief as she stepped back, shaking her head. I don't even want to know, she said, her voice trembling. I can't believe this. She turned and left the room before I could stop her, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. I stood there, frozen, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Beside me, she stayed silent, her expression unreadable. The line we'd crossed was no longer a secret, and the cracks in the foundation had finally split wide open. The sound of her car fading down the driveway left a void, a hollow emptiness that seemed to swallow the house whole. The front door had slammed shut with such force that the echo still lingered, vibrating through the walls, through me. She was gone, and with her departure, the fragile facade I'd tried to hold on is shattered completely. I stood in the living room, frozen in place. The air felt thicker than ever, suffocating and sharp. Every detail of the room stood out in perfect clarity. The uneven stack of magazines on the coffee table, the faint scuff marks on the wooden floor, the muted hum of the refrigerator in the next room. My mind latched onto these tiny, insignificant things, desperate to block out the weight of what had just happened. The kitchen behind me was silent. She was still there, though she hadn't moved. I didn't need to look to know that. Her presence was as tangible as the air I struggled to breathe, a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed. Time dragged, seconds stretching into minutes or maybe hours. I wasn't sure. My legs felt heavy as I finally moved, stepping toward the window. Outside, the garden was still slick with rain, the flowers bent under the weight of lingering drops. The world out there seemed so calm, so unaffected, and it only made the chaos inside me feel louder. The silence between us grew, pressing harder against my chest. The distance was physical and emotional, an unbridgeable chasm that neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. She didn't speak, and neither did I. Words felt useless now, inadequate to express the enormity of what had been lost. I wandered aimlessly through the house, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The familiar creaks of the old floorboards sounded foreign now, as though the house itself was rejecting me. Every room I entered felt smaller, the walls closing in, suffocating. Eventually, I ended up in the garden. The cool night air was a shock to my system, the damp grass soft beneath my feet. I stood there, staring up at the stars, their distant light piercing through the darkness. The sky was so vast, so endless, and yet I felt trapped, tethered to the ground by the weight of my mistakes. The garden had always been her space. She'd spent hours out here, tending to the plants, arranging the flower beds with meticulous care. Now, it felt like a graveyard of forgotten things, a reminder of everything that could never be undone. I stayed outside for what felt like hours, the chill sinking deep into my skin. The house loomed behind me, silent and still, a monument to everything that had gone wrong. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. Not yet. When I finally did, the weight of the night hit me all over again. The house was too quiet, the absence of her, both of them, impossible to ignore. The air was heavy with unspoken words, with regrets I couldn't begin to untangle. I found myself standing in the living room, staring at the empty couch where she had sat just hours before. The memory of her presence was unbearable, a ghost that refused to fade. As I sank into a chair, exhaustion washing over me, I realized there was no way to fix this. The cracks had become too wide, the damage too deep. Everything was broken now, and I had no idea how to live with the pieces. I woke up the next morning to the soft sounds of birds singing outside. The room, bathed in the golden light of early morning, felt oddly peaceful, though it wasn't the usual peace I had been used to. There was something different in the air, lighter, as though the weight of the past few days had begun to dissolve. But it wasn't the past that I was running from anymore. It was something deeper, something more personal that I had to face. The house was still. The usual hum of activity, the small sounds of life that always filled the space, were absent. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I moved quietly through the hallway, unsure of what to expect. Everything felt unfamiliar now, even the walls I had once called home. I walked into the kitchen, almost surprised to find her sitting there. She was by the window, a cup of tea in her hands, staring out at the garden. The sunlight hit her from the side, casting soft shadows across her face, making her look more fragile than I had seen her in days. Her presence wasn't as overwhelming as it had been in the past. There was a strange calm about her now, a calmness that almost made me feel like we were strangers in the same house, that I paused for a moment, just watching her, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched between us, but it didn't feel oppressive. It was simply there, as if it had always been a part of our relationship, unspoken yet understood. Finally, she turned to me. There was no anger in her eyes, no bitterness, just a quiet resignation. "I don't know how we got here," I said, breaking the stillness. The words felt so inadequate, but they were the only ones that came. She set her cup down slowly, meeting my gaze without flinching. "Neither do I," she said softly, but her voice carried something else, something I couldn't fully read. Maybe it was regret, maybe acceptance. I swallowed, the weight of the past few days catching up to me in an instant. There was nothing more to say. We had already said everything we needed to say. The words were no longer important. For the next few hours, we moved around each other like two ghosts, existing in the same space but unwilling to fully connect. There was no hostility between us, but neither was there comfort. It was the kind of silence that made you realize the gap between two people wasn't measured in words, but in time. The time that had passed, the time that had been lost, the time that couldn't be reclaimed. The day drifted by, and with each passing hour, I felt the tension between us fade just a little more. But there was no relief, no sense of closure, just an understanding that whatever had been was now over, and we had no choice but to move on. By the time the evening came, the sky outside was painted with shades of orange and pink. The house was bathed in the warm light of the setting sun, and for a brief moment, I could almost convince myself that everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. Not really. She stood by the window, the faint light casting a soft glow around her, and I couldn't help but wonder how we had come to this point. How had everything changed so quickly? It had started with something small, something seemingly insignificant, and then it had unraveled like thread coming loose from a worn sweater. She turned to face me, her expression calm, but her eyes filled with something deeper, something I couldn't name. "I'm leaving soon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question or a request, just a simple statement of fact. I nodded, the truth of it settling heavily in my chest. I had known this moment was coming, but hearing her say it out loud made it real. And now, standing there with her, I realized that this was the end. Not just of what we had, but of everything. I wanted to say something, anything. I wanted to tell her how much I regretted everything, how much I wished I could go back and fix things. But the words didn't come. They couldn't, because we had both known this was inevitable. There was a long pause. She turned away, heading toward the door, but before she left, she stopped. Her hand rested on the doorframe, and she glanced back at me. "Maybe this is for the best," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know if I should be angry, or relieved, or sad. The mixture of emotions swirled within me, each one fighting for dominance. But in that moment, I realized that none of it mattered. She was right. It was for the best. She left without another word, the door clicking softly behind her. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the space she had occupied. It felt empty now, the silence in the house thick and suffocating. But it was also freeing. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with myself, or where I was supposed to go. But in that moment, for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The next few days passed in a blur. I cleaned the house, sorted through old boxes, and tried to push the remnants of the past out of my mind. The days felt long, but at the same time, I knew they were healing me. I was moving on. Then, one evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I realized that I hadn't thought of her in hours. It wasn't that I had forgotten her. It was just that the space she had occupied in my life was no longer a void. It had filled with something new, something different. I stood up and walked inside, closing the door behind me. The house was quiet, and for the first time, I was okay with that. I was finally alone with myself, and I was okay with it. There was no going back. But I had learned that sometimes the hardest part isn't letting go. It's letting yourself move forward. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to do just that. As I stood there, looking out at the world, I felt something shift inside me. Something deep and lasting. And in that moment, I realized that I hadn't lost everything. I had found myself again.